I told my son the truth about his wife, but he spit in my face, so I destroyed their lives. Forgiveness isn't free. And my son is learning every day how high the price really is. The rain had been falling for 3 days straight in New Orleans, drumming against the old tin roof of Evelyn Carter's house, like an unrelenting memory she couldn't quite shake. The magnolia tree in the front yard dripped with heavy blossoms, their perfume mingling with the scent of damp earth. Inside, the house felt different now. Not empty, not frozen as it had been in those first hollow weeks after the humiliation, but heavy, filled with an unspoken weight that neither she nor her son dared touch. Jaden had returned 2 months earlier, not as the triumphant man who once strutted out the front door in defiance, but as a man who carried something like shame in his shoulders. Since the day Sloane had finally vanished from their lives, the woman who had poisoned her son's mind against her, Evelyn had waited for the storm inside her to settle. It hadn't. They spoke about safe things, the shift schedules at the port, the smell of the gumbo she simmered on Sundays, the stubborn leak in the upstairs bathroom, the way the rain made the streets shimmer at night. Everything but the thing. The moment when Jaden, in a fury stoked by Sloane's lies, had spat in his mother's face. She had washed her cheek that night, but no amount of soap could scrub away the line that had been crossed. On a gray Sunday morning, the turning point arrived quietly. Evelyn was in the kitchen, drying the last of the breakfast dishes, when she noticed Jaden standing in the living room, still as stone, staring at the old family photograph on the mantel. It was one she rarely looked at anymore. Jaden, at 6 years old, perched high on his father Thomas's shoulders, both of them grinning so wide it almost hurt to look at. Thomas had died years ago, but in that picture he was still solid and alive, the kind of man who could carry the world if it meant sparing his family the weight. Jaden's face now was nothing like the boy in the photo. His eyes were tight, and there was something in them she had never seen before. A raw hatred, but not for her, for himself. "I don't know how you can stand to have me in this house, Mom," he said, his voice a low rasp that barely carried across the room. Evelyn set the dish towel aside and walked in slowly, her bare feet silent on the old wood floor. "Then maybe it's time you explained to me, without excuses, what was really in your heart when you did what you did." He didn't move for a long moment, then turned toward her. The rain outside filled the silence between them. "Sloane, she twisted everything. Made me believe your love was just another way to control me, that you wanted to keep me small, dependent. She kept telling me she was the only one truly on my side." His voice cracked. "When you exposed her for what she was, I thought you were trying to destroy the only good thing I had left. I turned into something else." Evelyn's expression didn't soften. "That something else was already in you, Jaden. Sloane didn't plant it. She just fed it. She aimed it at me because she knew it would break us both." The words landed between them like stones dropped in water. Jaden swallowed hard, as if he'd been hoping she would absolve him by blaming Sloane entirely. "You spit in my face," she said quietly, "and you can't take that back. That moment killed a part of the trust I had in you. Love." She shook her head slightly. "Love remains. Mothers are built that way. But respect and trust can only be rebuilt by what you do, not what you say." He lowered his gaze. "What do you want me to do?" Her voice was calm, but there was steel in it. "You become a man of dignity. You treat women, me first of all, with respect. You own your mistakes without flinching. You go to therapy. You pay your debts, not just the ones you can count in dollars. You live honestly and build something real, something clean. And you stop chasing the kind of happiness you can show off like a trophy. Go find the kind that lasts. It wasn't an embrace. It was a challenge, a contract carved out of hard truth. For a long moment, Jaden just stood there, breathing as if the air had turned to water. Then he gave a short, almost imperceptible nod. That afternoon, they didn't speak again about it. Evelyn made red beans and rice. Jaden fixed the hinge on the back door without being asked. They sat at the table together, but let the rain do the talking. In the days that followed, a quiet shift began. Jaden moved out within the month, selling his expensive car and renting a modest apartment in mid-city. He didn't call to ask if she wanted him over for Sunday dinners. He didn't flood her with apologies. Instead, once a month, an envelope arrived in her mailbox, a short letter in his own handwriting. No drama, no pleas for forgiveness, just updates. Work was steady. Therapy was uncomfortable, but eye-opening. He'd learned he chased approval like oxygen, feared failure like death, and carried a streak of anger he recognized from the proud Southern men he'd grown up around. Evelyn read each letter with a mix of maternal pride and wary caution. She kept them in a drawer, tied with a thin piece of ribbon. She didn't write back. Her wound was healing, but it was still tender. Outside her own life began to expand again. She cleared the house of the last traces of Sloane's presence, the throw pillows she had once mocked, the whiskey glasses she'd left behind. She picked up quilting again, filled her Sundays with church, and the warm chatter of her circle of friends. It was a new kind of quiet, not the suffocating stillness of betrayal, but the sovereign silence of a woman who had reclaimed her home, her time, and her peace. The summer slid into autumn almost without notice, the sticky heat of New Orleans giving way to softer breezes scented with oak and the faint smoke of backyard grills. Evelyn marked the passing of months not by calendars but by small, unremarkable changes. The way the late afternoon light shifted across her kitchen floor, the new flowers blooming in her neighbor's yard, the thinning stack of bills she managed without strain. Jaden's absence was at first an ache, then a background hum she could live with. The quiet of the house no longer gnawed at her. It wrapped around her like a quilt she'd stitched herself. Each morning she rose before the sun, made coffee strong enough to cut through the damp, and sat by the front window watching the street come alive, the mail truck, the joggers, the old man with the dachshund who stopped to wave even if they'd never spoken. The letters kept coming, always on the first week of the month. One in September described his decision to trade the bar scene for evenings spent reading, books about business ethics, relationships, and history. October's letter mentioned his therapy sessions where he'd unearth the sharp edges of his own pride and trace them back to childhood moments he'd never examined. In November, he wrote about volunteering at a community center, teaching teenagers the basics of managing money, showing them how to read a paycheck and not spend it before the ink dried. Evelyn would read each letter twice, first as a mother scanning for sincerity, then as a woman trying to decide if trust could grow back the way magnolia branches did after a hard pruning. She never wrote back. Not yet. Her own life was steady, even bright in places. She'd returned to quilting with a devotion that surprised her, piecing together patterns she remembered from her grandmother's hands. On Sundays after church, she lingered over coffee with her friends, the conversation winding through scripture, recipes, and the slow politics of the neighborhood. When they asked about Jaden, she'd smile lightly and say, "He's working on himself," which was both the truth and enough to stop further questions. Still, there were moments when the memory of that day, the spit, the burning humiliation, would flare unbidden. It wasn't just the act, it was the knowledge that it had come from her own child, the boy she'd carried, fed, defended, No therapy, no letter could erase that, but perhaps, she thought, it didn't need to be erased to be healed. The shift came quietly, almost exactly 11 months after he'd left. It was her birthday, a Sunday washed in pale winter sunlight. She'd planned nothing beyond a quiet afternoon with her quilting frame. The knock on the door startled her. When she opened it, there was no Jaden, only a delivery man holding a large terracotta pot, its weight balanced carefully in his arms. Inside the pot was a young magnolia tree, its glossy leaves catching the light. A small card was tied to one of its slender branches. In Jaden's handwriting, the words were simple. "Happy birthday, Mom. I want to become the man Dad would have been proud of. I love you. Jaden." The tears came before she could stop them, hot and freeing. The magnolia was Thomas's favorite tree. He'd planted one in their yard the year Jaden was born, saying it would grow alongside their son. That tree still stood out front, tall and strong. This new one was a promise, not of erasing the past, but of building something new beside it. That evening the phone rang. His voice on the other end was steady, almost careful. "Did you get it?" "I did," she said. Silence for a moment, but not the heavy kind. "I didn't want to make today about me," he said. "I just wanted you to know I'm still trying." Evelyn closed her eyes, letting the words settle. "I know," she said simply, and it was enough for now. The months that followed confirmed the change was more than a gesture. Jaden kept working, kept his life clean. No sudden grand declarations, no social media parades. He showed up where it mattered, at the community center, at his job, in the quiet discipline of paying bills on time and keeping promises. Evelyn didn't rush to fold him back into her daily life, but she began answering his calls, meeting him for lunch once in a while, talking about things that mattered and things that didn't. The day she finally invited him back for Sunday dinner, it felt like slipping on a coat she hadn't worn in years. Familiar, but different enough to notice the new fit. They ate gumbo at her kitchen table, laughter easing into the corners where silence had once lived. Forgiveness didn't arrive as a single moment. It grew in the spaces between these small acts. It wasn't something she spoke aloud. It was in the coffee she poured for him without asking how he took it, in the way she could look at him now without seeing only that terrible day. For Evelyn, the victory wasn't just in getting her son back. It was in proving, to herself most of all, that love could survive betrayal, but only when paired with boundaries strong enough to hold. She had dismantled the dangerous myth of endless maternal sacrifice, replacing it with something truer. Respect, once lost, must be earned, and self-respect must never be traded, not even for family. Jaden had never been the kind of man to linger in silence. For most of his adult life, he filled quiet moments with noise, music, television, his own voice telling half-truths to make himself look better. But after moving out of his mother's house that spring, silence became a kind of discipline. It was awkward at first, even painful. Alone in his one-bedroom apartment in mid-city, he learned the sound of his own refrigerator cycling, the creak of the floorboards when the upstairs neighbor walked at night, the way the traffic on Canal Street softened after midnight. It was in those silences that the truth started to take shape. Therapy helped, yes, but the real work happened in the unlit spaces between sessions. He began to realize just how thoroughly Sloane had mapped out the weak spots in him and how eagerly he'd let her. Sloane had been clever, not just in the way she smiled or flattered him, but in how she framed the world. She told him stories about manipulative parents, about people who pretended to love while holding others back. She fed him little warnings disguised as advice. Don't let anyone make you feel like you owe them for raising you. Don't confuse control for care. She said these things so often they became part of his own voice, echoing in his head whenever he argued with Evelyn. The day he spat in his mother's face, he thought he was defending himself. In reality, he was burning a bridge to the only person who had ever stood firmly in his corner. That image haunted him now, her face after the spit landed, not angry so much as hollow. He hadn't realized until months later that the hollowness was worse than rage. Rage meant there was still energy, still investment. Hollowness was withdrawal. So he started over. The first step was selling the car. It had been a status symbol, a way to look successful when his bank account said otherwise. The day he handed the keys to the buyer, he felt lighter. The money went toward rent, bills, and clearing the smaller debts that had been dragging behind him like anchors. Next came the job. He'd been working irregular shifts at the docks, taking just enough hours to scrape by. Now he asked for full-time work, showing up early, staying late when needed, keeping his head down, and his output steady. Word got around that Jaden Carter wasn't just showing up, he was pulling his weight. The letters to his mother were his way of keeping himself accountable. He didn't expect replies, but writing them forced him to take stock each month. What had he actually done to change? What patterns had he noticed in himself? Sometimes the letters were only a paragraph long, other times they filled 2 pages. But he never asked for forgiveness in them. He knew that was hers to give, in her time or not at all. By the 6th month, therapy had dug deep enough to uncover things he didn't want to face. His therapist, a patient man named Mr. Harlan, had a way of letting Jaden hear his own contradictions. "You talk about respect," Harlan said one evening, "but you treat it like a currency you only spend when it benefits you. That's not respect, that's leverage." It stung because it was true. He remembered the many times he'd been polite or generous when it got him something, a favor, a bit of admiration, a smoother path. Rarely had he done it simply because it was right. Harlan also pressed him on the matter of women, not just his mother, but all women. "You want to be a man your father would respect? Then you start by respecting women without expecting them to mother you or admire you for doing the bare minimum." Jaden thought about that for days. He'd seen his father, Thomas, treat Evelyn with a quiet, steady regard that had nothing to do with grand gestures. Even when they argued, Thomas never tried to diminish her. Jaden had mistaken that kind of respect for weakness once. Now he saw it for the strength it was. The volunteering at the community center came from a conversation with one of the dock workers, a man named Lester, who ran a financial literacy class for teens in Trem. "Half these kids," Lester told him, "don't even know how a checking account works. The first time they get a paycheck, they spend it on sneakers and phones, and then they're broke again." Jaden asked if he could help. At first, he thought he'd just sit in and observe. But within a few weeks, he was running segments on budgeting and saving, using his own financial mistakes as cautionary tales. Standing in front of those teenagers, he felt something he hadn't in years. The satisfaction of giving without angling for something in return. Still, there were nights when the old shame came back, sharp and hot. When it did, he didn't drown it in drink or noise. He let it sit. He let it remind him why he was doing all this. When Evelyn's birthday approached, he wanted to mark it without turning it into a plea for reconciliation. The magnolia came to him almost immediately, his father's favorite, a living thing that could grow in her yard as a sign of what he was trying to do in himself. He had it delivered, with the note that said only what needed to be said. When she answered his call that night and said, "I know," he felt a tension loosen in his chest. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was the first plank in a bridge he hoped to rebuild. In the months after, he kept at the work. No rushing, no corner cutting. If he learned anything that year, it was that trust, once broken, had to be earned in silence and shown in consistency. For Evelyn Carter, the year after Sloane's departure and Jaden's exile was not simply a recovery period, it was a reclamation. She didn't think of it that way at first. The early weeks felt more like survival, a matter of moving from one day to the next without letting grief or bitterness turn her house into a tomb. But somewhere between the quiet mornings with coffee and the long afternoons quilting by the front window, she began to sense the slow rebuilding of something she'd almost forgotten, her own life, untethered from anyone else's chaos. She kept the boundaries firm. No surprise visits, no weekly check-ins, no falling into the easy habit of letting his needs dictate her time. She didn't stalk his social media. In fact, she unfollowed him entirely. If Jaden wanted to prove he'd changed, he'd have to do it in the real world, not through curated snapshots and captions. The letters were her measure of that. Each one arrived in his neat but unpolished handwriting, and she read them in her kitchen with the same ritual. Glasses perched on her nose, cup of chicory coffee cooling at her elbow, the ticking of the wall clock keeping time. The September letter spoke of routine, waking early, working full shifts at the docks, cooking his own meals instead of living on takeout. October's was about therapy, how the sessions were unearthing old patterns, how hard it was to sit with discomfort instead of running from it. November brought the first mention of the community center and the teenagers he was teaching. Evelyn smiled at that one, not because she thought it meant he'd been transformed, but because it showed he'd found a place to give without expecting something back. Still, she didn't respond. Healing her wound wasn't just about watching him change. It was about ensuring she didn't step back into the role of unconditional forgiver. The spit in her face had not been a simple outburst. It was the culmination of years of small dismissals, cutting words, and the entitlement Sloane had merely sharpened. Evelyn had tolerated too much in the name of maternal love. She would not make that mistake again. She filled her days with things that had nothing to do with him. She joined the quilting circle at her church again, where the women stitched as they traded recipes, news, and scripture. She started tending the small garden in her backyard, coaxing tomatoes, peppers, and herbs from the rich Louisiana soil. On Saturdays, she went with friends to the farmer's market, savoring the way the air smelled of pralines and fresh bread. What surprised her most was the peace she felt in her own home. It was as if clearing out the last of Sloane's influence, the whiskey tumblers, the throw blankets she'd sneered at, had let fresh air in. She even repainted the living room, choosing a soft moss green that reminded her of the bayou in spring. Then came her birthday. The delivery man on her porch, the young magnolia in its terracotta pot, the note in Jaden's handwriting, it all cracked something open in her. She carried the pot to the backyard herself, set it on the patio table, and read the card again and again. I want to become the man Dad would have been proud of. Thomas. It had been years since she'd heard Jaden speak of his father without bitterness or casual dismissal. Seeing his name in that context felt like a small miracle. That evening's phone call was brief, almost cautious. He didn't press for a visit, didn't try to steer the conversation toward forgiveness. I just wanted you to know I'm still trying, he said. Evelyn's reply, I know, was all she could offer, and all he seemed to need. After that, she began to let small changes in. She answered his occasional calls. When he suggested lunch one afternoon at a little po' boy shop halfway between their neighborhoods, she agreed. The conversation was easy, almost ordinary, talk of the Saints season, the price of shrimp, the latest neighborhood gossip. Not once did they touch the old wound. By spring, she invited him back for Sunday dinner. It was a test for them both. She made gumbo the way Thomas had liked it, rich and spicy, with potato salad on the side. Jaden arrived on time, a bouquet of fresh-cut lilies in his hands. They ate at her kitchen table, the rain tapping softly against the windows, laughter returning in gentle bursts like a bird testing the air before settling on a branch. Forgiveness, she realized, was not a declaration. It was the quiet choice to let new moments replace the old ones, to allow trust to sprout again in soil once scorched. Months turned into another year, and Evelyn could see the change wasn't a phase. Jaden kept his life clean and steady. He stayed with the community center, expanded the financial literacy classes, even started mentoring a few of the older teens as they navigated their first jobs. There was no grand redemption arc, no cinematic reunion, just the slow, steady building of a man's character. Evelyn's own life flourished alongside his. She traveled for the first time in years, taking a bus trip with her church group to Natchez to tour the historic homes. She sold a few of her quilts at a craft fair. She spent afternoons on the porch, the new magnolia's leaves rustling in the breeze, a living reminder that growth takes time but is worth the wait. Looking back, she knew the real victory wasn't in getting her son back. It was in breaking the unspoken contract that mothers must always sacrifice, even in the face of disrespect. She had given him love, but she had also given him a line he could not cross again without losing her for good. And in respecting that line, he had finally started to respect himself. It was a humid July afternoon when Evelyn first saw Jaden in what she privately called his second life. The air over Treme shimmered with heat, and the cicadas were so loud they seemed to buzz inside her skull. She had come to the community center to drop off a stack of donated quilts, the soft kind you could pull over your knees while reading, not the heavy showpieces she sold at the craft fair. She hadn't told Jaden she was coming. This was her project, her donation. If she saw him, so be it. The building was alive with movement. The rhythmic bounce of basketballs in the gym, the sharp clack of pool balls in the game room, the chatter of teenagers spilling into the hallway between classes. The front desk volunteer, a woman Evelyn knew from church, waved her through to one of the smaller classrooms. And there he was. Jaden stood at the whiteboard, marker in hand, drawing a diagram that looked more like a recipe than a financial chart. 6 teenagers leaned forward in their chairs, watching him. He wasn't performing, he wasn't playing to the crowd. His voice was steady, almost conversational. Rule number 1, he said, tapping the board. Your first paycheck is not for shoes, it's not for a phone, it's not for a party. You give yourself breathing room first. That means savings. Even if it's just $20, that $20 will save you from borrowing $50 later. One of the boys, lanky wearing a cap backward, muttered something. Jaden laughed, shook his head and said, I used to think like you. Ask me how many times I ended up broke and blaming somebody else. Go ahead, too many. The room erupted in laughter, but it was the warm kind. Evelyn watched the way he listened when a girl in the front row raised her hand, how he nodded and repeated her question so everyone could hear. There was no impatience in him, no restless shifting like before. When the session ended, he collected their worksheets, promised to email them resources, and told them he'd be there next week. Same time, same place. The kids left in clusters, still talking about what he'd said. He turned then and saw her in the doorway. For a heartbeat, surprise flickered across his face, followed by something more careful. Not fear, not guilt, but a kind of readiness. Hey, Ma, he said, wiping his hands on his jeans. She stepped inside, setting the quilts on a table. I didn't know you'd be here. Brought these for the lounge. Figured the kids could use something warm for reading or just sitting. He ran his fingers over the top quilt, tracing the stitches. You made these? I did. She glanced at the whiteboard. You're a good teacher. The compliment seemed to land heavier than she intended. He nodded once, quietly. Trying to be. They walked out together into the bright glare of the street. The heat hit like a wall, but Evelyn felt oddly light. It wasn't the same as pride, and that came too easily and could vanish just as fast. This was something sturdier, the sense that she was seeing the man her late husband had always hoped Jaden would become. They stopped at the corner where her car was parked. You busy Sunday? He asked. I can be, she said. Come by my place, I'll cook. That made her laugh, an honest, surprised laugh that loosened her shoulders. You can cook now? He smiled, but there was no cockiness in it. I can feed you without poisoning you. That's a start. Sunday came and she climbed the narrow stairs to his apartment carrying a loaf of bread from the bakery she liked. The place was modest, one bedroom, small living room, neat kitchen, but it was clean, organized. No pile of unopened mail, no beer bottles, no sour smell of neglect. He served her red beans and rice, slow cooked the way Thomas used to make with a side of collard greens. The conversation was unhurried, weaving through safe topics at first, food, music, the upcoming Saints game, before touching on deeper ones. At one point, he set his fork down and said, I know I can't erase what I did, Ma, but I want you to know I think about it every day. Not to punish myself, but to remember what I can't be again. Evelyn looked at him for a long moment. Good, she said finally. Some mistakes you don't forget, you use them as guardrails. They didn't talk about forgiveness or the exact moment when the bridge between them would be fully rebuilt. Instead, they shared a meal, washed the dishes together, and she left with a small container of leftovers. Driving home, Evelyn realized this was the first time in years she'd left her son's company without feeling the weight of unspoken resentment. The road ahead was still long, but for the first time it felt like they were walking it in the same direction. 2 weeks later, the test came without warning. It was a Thursday evening. The sky over New Orleans painted in bruised purples and golds from a summer storm rolling out toward the Gulf. Evelyn was in her kitchen putting the final stitches into a quilt she planned to gift at a church fundraiser when her phone buzzed. Jaden's name lit up the screen. Ma, I need a favor, he said, his voice steady but with that faint edge she recognized, the one that used to come right before a request she wouldn't like. What kind of favor? I've been working with one of the teens from the center, Marcus. He's been staying with his aunt, but she kicked him out last night. He's sleeping on a friend's couch. I told him I'd ask if he could crash at your place for a couple nights, just until we figure something out. Evelyn's first instinct was to say no, not because of Marcus, whom she'd never met, but because she'd lived too many years with other people's emergencies taking over her life. Still, there was something in Jaden's tone, not entitlement, not assumption, but careful respect, that made her pause. Why my place? She asked. Because his aunt lives 2 blocks from me, and if she sees him near my building, it might make things worse. And I trust you to keep him safe until I can talk to a social worker tomorrow. That word, trust, landed differently now. Once, it had been a word he tossed around to soften her up. Tonight, it sounded earned. All right, she said, 1 night. He follows my rules, and you pick him up at 9 sharp tomorrow morning. By 8 o'clock, Marcus was standing in her doorway, tall, thin, wearing a backpack that sagged with more air than belongings. He was polite, called her ma'am, and kept his eyes down as she showed him the small guest room. Dinner was leftover jambalaya and cornbread. He ate quietly, thanked her twice, and disappeared into the room to sleep. Evelyn found herself standing in the hallway afterward, listening to the faint rhythm of his breathing, thinking about all the times she'd opened her home out of guilt or obligation. This felt different. This was a choice, and it was bound by clear terms. The next morning, Jaden arrived exactly at 9. Marcus came out with his backpack already slung over his shoulder, and the two of them exchanged a handshake that looked more like a promise. "Thank you, Ma," Jaden said as they stood on the porch, "for trusting me on this." She studied him for a moment. His eyes didn't dart away. He didn't try to fill the air with charm. He was standing there as a man, fully aware that she could have said no, and grateful she hadn't. That weekend, she got a short letter from him. He wrote about how Marcus had been connected to a program for youth housing, how the boy had shown up at the center later that week with a clean shirt and a smile. He didn't make himself the hero of the story, just noted the outcome and thanked her again for her part in it. The incident lingered in her mind because it was the first time she'd seen him handle responsibility without letting it slide into dependency. He hadn't dumped the problem on her. He'd involved her in a solution. That was new. That was growth. By late summer, small patterns began to knit themselves between them again. He called on Sundays, sometimes to invite her to lunch, sometimes just to talk about the weather or a Saints game. When she mentioned she needed her gutters cleared, he showed up with a ladder, gloves, and the quiet efficiency of someone who understood that help was about doing, not promising. One afternoon, she found herself telling him a story she hadn't thought about in years, the time his father had driven halfway to Baton Rouge in the middle of the night to bring her the sewing machine she'd forgotten for a quilting retreat. Jaden listened, smiling faintly. "He was always like that?" he asked. "Not always, but often enough to make me feel I could count on him." Jaden nodded, his gaze drifting toward the magnolia in her yard. "I want to be like that." It was not a grand statement, not the kind of vow that invites applause. But Evelyn believed him in that moment, not because of the words, but because of the months of quiet work behind them. In early September, she attended one of the financial literacy workshops. This time, Jaden introduced her to the teens as "my mom, the smartest woman I know about making something last." The kids clapped politely, and Evelyn felt an odd heat rise in her chest. Not pride exactly, something closer to relief. The sense that the respect she had once feared was gone forever had found its way back. After the workshop, they walked to her car. The air was thick with the smell of rain on hot pavement. "You know," she said as she unlocked the door, "trust is a bit like your budget lessons. You don't rebuild it with one big deposit. You make steady, small ones until the account's healthy again." He smiled. "Guess I'm on the installment plan then." She laughed, shaking her head. "You'd better keep up the payments." And for the first time in a long, long while, she realized she wanted him to. By the time autumn settled over New Orleans, the heat had eased into something almost forgiving. The air smelled of wood smoke in the evenings, and the magnolia in Evelyn's yard, still young, still finding its place, had sprouted its first tight green buds. She'd like to sit on the porch in the early mornings with her chicory coffee, watching the light change across those glossy leaves, thinking about how some things took root quietly, without anyone noticing until they were already strong enough to stand on their own. It was on one such morning that Jaden called. His voice carried a current of something she hadn't heard in years, excitement, but tempered, like he was holding it back to make sure it was real before he said too much. "Ma, I've been invited to speak at the high school in Treme next month," he told her. "They want me to talk about starting over, about, mistakes, choices, real stuff." Evelyn smiled into her mug. Sounds like they picked the right man for the job. He hesitated, then asked, "Will you come? I mean, only if you want to." She considered it for a moment, not because she didn't want to support him, but because she knew the weight her presence would carry. If she showed up, it would mean she was willing to stand publicly in the space where he was trying to rebuild himself. That was no small thing. "I'll be there," she said finally. "But you'd better give them more than a budget lecture." He laughed. "Don't worry, I've got stories." The weeks leading up to the talk passed in a slow, deliberate rhythm. Evelyn kept to her routines, quilting, church, tending her small garden. But she found herself thinking often about what Jaden might say. She wondered if he'd talk about Sloane, about the years he'd wasted, about the damage that couldn't be undone. She also wondered if he'd mention her at all. And strangely, she realized she didn't need him to. This wasn't about her pride anymore. It was about whether he could hold his head up in front of a room full of strangers and speak the truth without hiding behind charm or excuses. When the day arrived, the high school auditorium smelled faintly of floor polish and paper. Evelyn took a seat in the third row, her hands folded loosely in her lap. Jaden walked onto the stage wearing a simple navy shirt and dark jeans, no tie, no jacket, just himself. He glanced around the room, found her face, and gave a small nod before starting. He didn't begin with his resume or a prepared joke. He began with a confession. "I used to think every bad thing in my life was somebody else's fault," he said. "If I messed up, it was because someone pushed me. If I failed, it was because someone didn't help me enough. That's a comfortable way to live, until you realize it's also a way to stay exactly the same forever." Evelyn watched as he spoke about the years of drifting, about chasing the wrong kind of approval, about the anger he didn't understand until it hurt, the one person who'd never turned her back on him. He didn't name her, but the weight of that omission felt intentional, protective. He wasn't using her pain as a prop. He was owning his role in it, without dragging her into the spotlight. When he finished, the applause was warm, not polite. Students lined up to shake his hand, to ask questions. He stayed until the last one left. Only then did he walk down to where Evelyn was standing, her coat folded over one arm. "Not bad," she said with a small smile. He grinned. "High praise." They walked out together into the late afternoon light. The air was cool, the sun low over the rooftops. Halfway to her car, he stopped. "Ma," he said quietly, "I know you didn't come today for you, but I'm glad you did. It means more than I can explain." She looked at him for a moment, then reached out and adjusted the collar of his shirt the way she used to when he was a boy. "I came because you've been making the payments," she said, echoing her own words from months ago. He laughed, but there was something in his eyes. Gratitude, yes, but also relief. Like a man who'd been walking a long road and had finally found the right mile marker. That night, back at home, Evelyn sat on her porch, the magnolia's leaves whispering in the dark. She thought about the long arc of the past 2 years, about how grief and betrayal had given way to boundaries and boundaries to respect. She didn't kid herself. Life had a way of testing even the strongest growth. But for now there was peace. And peace, she decided, was enough. 3 years later, the magnolia in Evelyn's yard had grown tall enough to cast a soft shadow over the porch in late afternoon. Its branches, now thick with glossy leaves, carried blooms the size of saucers, creamy white, fragrant, and impossibly delicate-looking despite their strength. Evelyn liked to sit beneath it in the evenings, a glass of sweet tea at her elbow, and think about how far things had come since the days when her house felt like a fortress against her own son. Jaden didn't live in the same apartment anymore. He'd saved enough for a down payment on a small shotgun-style house a few blocks from the community center. The place wasn't grand. 2 bedrooms, a narrow kitchen, and a backyard that needed more work than he'd realized. But it was his. He'd painted the shutters himself, a deep green that reminded Evelyn of the bayou after rain. Their relationship had settled into something steady and unforced. There were still traces of the past in the way they sometimes paused before speaking, as if both were checking the ground for cracks before stepping forward. But those pauses had grown shorter. Conversations flowed. Laughter was easier. One Sunday afternoon, she drove over to his house for a barbecue he was hosting for some of the teenagers from the center, now young adults starting college or working full-time jobs. She arrived to find the backyard strung with lights, the grill smoking, music drifting from a speaker in the corner. Jaden stood at the grill, tongs in hand, talking to a group of kids about budgeting for rent. When he saw her, he waved with the tongs and called out, "Ma's here, somebody get her a chair." A tall young man she recognized as Marcus hurried over, grinning. "You're Miss Evelyn? Jaden's told me a lot about you." "All lies, I hope," she said, taking the chair he offered. As the evening unfolded, Evelyn watched her son move through the crowd, checking on the food, refilling drinks, making sure no one felt left out. It struck her that this was the same boy who once couldn't keep a promise for more than a week, now keeping dozens of small promises in the span of a few hours. Later, when most of the guests had left, Jaden brought her a plate of leftover peach cobbler. They sat on the back steps, the scent of magnolia mixing with charcoal smoke. "You've built yourself a good life," she said quietly. He shrugged, but there was a slow smile on his face. "Didn't do it alone, and I don't just mean the people who helped me, I mean the people who refused to make it easy. You, especially." Evelyn looked out at the yard, the string lights swaying gently in the breeze. "It wasn't about making it hard, Jaden. It was about making it real." He nodded, taking a forkful of cobbler. "I get that now. Back then, I thought love meant you'd always catch me no matter how many times I fell. Now I know love's making sure I learn how to land on my own feet." The sky had deepened to a soft indigo, the first stars peeking through. Evelyn thought of Thomas then, of the way he used to sit with Jaden on the porch, telling him stories about growing up in the 9th Ward, teaching him how to throw a football. She wondered what he would say if he could see their son now. As if reading her mind, Jaden said, "I think Dad would have liked this house." "I think he would have liked the man who owns it," she replied. They fell into a comfortable silence, listening to the cicadas and the faint hum of the street beyond the fence. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. Life still had its messiness, its risks, its unspoken truths. But the wounds that once seemed too deep to heal had become part of the foundation, not forgotten but transformed into something solid. When Evelyn drove home later that night, the magnolia in her yard was lit by the porch light, its leaves casting gentle shadows across the steps. She paused before going inside, resting a hand against the rough bark. Growth was never quick, never simple, but standing there in the quiet, she knew, in her bones, that it was possible. And that, she thought with a small, steady smile, was enough.